The 2024 NFL Combine is underway, and it's time for Elijah Jones and Christian Mahogany to shine.
You are Locked On Boston College, your daily podcast on the Boston College Eagles, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Boston College Nation. This is AJ Black, editor and publisher of Eagle Insider. Today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go for your next big adventure. Check them out today at nissanusa.com. Now, the NFL draft is right around the corner, and the first big event that in this process is the NFL Draft Combine, which is underway. On today's show, we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about Tim Lewis again. We've got the expert on today, and that is Mitch Wolfe of Eagle Insider. Mitch, how's it going?
It's going well. I'm excited to be back on the show talking about the Combine, which is one of my favorite events of the year, honestly. I spent today watching the defensive front seven players was today, and then we'll get DBs and tight ends now today on Friday, get offensive skill positions, and then I think wrap up. I think the offensive line is the final group this year. So we'll see Elijah Jones today for when you're listening on Friday, and then Christian Mahogany on Sunday.
So let's kick it off with Elijah Jones, who spoke highly of Jeff Hafley in a press conference today, which I know, Mitch, this has been kind of weird hearing all of that, but he spoke about that. Now let's talk about what you're expecting from Jones in this draft. And maybe you want to give a shout out to the Green Bay Packer writers that keep talking about him getting drafted by Hafley.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I thought that the suspension that finished Jones's year would play a bigger role. And I think Jones smartly played it. He's not going to come out and, completely trash his coach, because that's not going to look good for his draft stock if he's publicly trashing his coach during a media session. So he played that smart. And maybe he does honestly believe that. Maybe he did something, whatever his suspension was, that was wrong, and he knows it, and he understands the suspension. But, I think that lessens his chances of going to the Packers, at least from where they would be if given that Hafley is defensive coordinator there. But Jones is an interesting case because with cornerbacks, especially with one like Jones, who is very tall, he was measured at 6'1" at the Senior Bowl. It shouldn't be too different from that. And 181 pounds, maybe 182 at the Senior Bowl, which is improved from where I think he was listed at for BC. So that's good to see. But with guys that thin, it's kind of difficult because you would kind of expect them to run fast, and especially for somebody like Jones, who's a little lankier. So you expect him to maybe not have the best start off the gate, but given his long legs, that'll allow him to cover ground quickly. So Dane Brugler, the athletics NFL draft expert, mentioned Jones as somebody he expects to test pretty well in the 40. The agility drills, a lot of guys don't do them as much anymore because they're the last drill. They're usually later into the night. So they don't feel as good about doing them. I think now they've bumped up the combine to more happening during the day and the evening, as opposed to last year and maybe the year before, where it was just at night, which was really rough. Went on until like 11 p.m. Eastern, which was crazy. But still, it'll be interesting to see if he does the agility drills. I imagine his jumps should be pretty decent. Again, long limbs tend to help with that. But with his build, you're going to need the agilities and speed stuff. It almost doesn't matter as much because you kind of expect him to be fast. So as long as he doesn't run, a 4.6 or higher or anything catastrophically bad, teams are going to be more concerned about his ability to hold up against physicality in the NFL, which obviously that's not something you're dealing with at the combine. I think that the fact that he improved his ball skills a lot this year in terms of getting interceptions, his passes defense, that's going to help out during the positional drills. If he had entered the draft last year, I would have been very concerned about that because that was something that just wasn't in his game. But overall, I think that this should be a solid event for Jones as long as the interviews go well. Right now, I feel like he is a mid-day 3 prospect. Obviously had a really good year this year going up until the suspension. I would say he has improved every year, which is a lot of teams really like to see that. He is an older prospect a bit, so that's a little concerning. But I think at the end, ultimately he's going to have value on special teams because he has length and he has speed. And he has shown he has experience playing special teams and he's gotten better at tackling. So teams will like that. So you can at least start him out doing that. And then if you need to get him in the lineup because of injuries as a corner, I don't think he's going to get embarrassed at this point. So I think a day 3 selection is appropriate for that because Jones has had some good games this year, but again, like he's not a true lockdown, shut down every receiver that he comes up against, even though this year he was definitely his best season.
All right, now let's move on to Christian Mahogany, and I know this is one of our favorites here on this podcast. A frequent listener who was always popping up in our comments section. Mahogany, I saw Pro Football Focus basically put up that he had a clean sheet all year. This is a big combine for Christian, who could be going day 2.
Yeah, I feel pretty good about him going in day 2, probably somewhere at the end of round 2, maybe early round 3, depending on how the board falls. But with Christian, I don't think obviously with the offensive line, the combine is as important because a lot of the drills they're measuring are things that don't really matter. Like obviously the 40-yard dash does not really matter for offensive linemen, especially for interior offensive linemen. Even the agility and explosiveness drills don't matter as much, especially for interior linemen, because you don't need that explosiveness out of your stance to get on to cover the edge of the pocket. Bench press will probably be important. Obviously, I'm not sure if he's going to participate in that. But I imagine he will, given that he's a pretty strong guy. But I think the positional drills will be important for him. Again, a lot of Christian's best qualities are the kind of the opposite of Jones, where it's the physical nature. So, the combine isn't necessarily the best thing for him because you don't get to put your hands on people and drive them off the ball and whatever. So, I think this is more about the interviews for him, which I imagine he'll ace. Obviously, he's a pretty charismatic personality. Very hardworking player. So I think teams will really like him. So I think that's more important for him in this combine process. And I think that as long as he doesn't, completely botch the drills, which I don't anticipate that happening. I think he's a pretty solid athlete. Maybe not a great athlete, but decently good. And I think he'll be able to solidify his ranking as a top 75-ish prospect. And at the end of the day, Mahogany's a guy that if you're a team that runs a lot of gap scheme runs, hard play action, he's a guy that you can just say, okay, we put him in as our starter week 1 and we feel pretty good about his ability to do his job well.
Now, one snub from this combine, and I felt like he would have been a fun one to watch, would have been Kyle Hergel. Just to see him lift, I think would have been.
Yeah, that definitely would have been true. I think I imagine he's working on that for the pro day, and that should be something special. I don't know what the record is off the top of my head for bench press. I believe it's in the 40s at 225, which is pretty incredible. And the guys who have done it, are pretty rare specimens. And I think Hergel is built well for it because one of the most important things about the bench press is you need to have shorter arms. So you'll see these like huge offensive tackles. So you think, oh, they're just so big, they're so strong, this should be easy for them. But because they have to stretch their arms out so far to lock out and get the rep to count, that expends more energy and they can't do it as much. What you want is these guys who are a little shorter, a little stouter, maybe don't have very long arms that can have basically they don't have to work as hard to get the bar up to where it needs to be, so then they can crank out those reps no problem. But yeah, I think Hergel would have impressed had he been invited to this one. I'm disappointed he wasn't, because I think he could have solidified himself as a day 3 prospect, as a depth piece in the interior offensive line.
All right, in a moment, Mitch and I are going to talk about Tim Lewis again. We have some thoughts about this, and it's more. I'm going beyond I'm confused on who Tim Lewis is. We're going to dive into who he is and what he could be bringing to Boston College and how the defense could change around. You're going to want to hear my thoughts and Mitch's thoughts on that in just a moment. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. Like the 2024 Nissan Rogue. It's perfect for city drives and great escapes. With class-exclusive Google built-in, it's always updating assistant to call on almost everything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play stores are right at your fingertips with a 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system. The 2024 Rogue is perfect mid-size crossover for your next adventure. Also, check out the Nissan Pathfinder. Has room for up to 8 and expansive cargo capacity and advanced available 4x4 capability. With 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds towing, when adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. So take the Nissan Rogue or the Nissan Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Go shop nissanusa.com. Locked on BC, AJ Black. Now, about 2 weeks ago, maybe about 2 weeks ago, we got the news that Bill O'Brien found his defensive coordinator, and it's Tim Lewis. And I had a whole episode where the title of the episode was "Who?" and I got a lot of angry, a lot of angry commenters on there, telling me I don't know what I'm talking about, and what did you think BC was going to get Rex Ryan and who was that? I forget who the other name was that they said they should have got, but
Mike Pettin.
Yeah, Mike Pettin. Which I say, and they said my favorite comment in all of these comments about Tim Lewis is his resume speaks for himself. And as I texted to Mitch, I'm not going to bash Tim Lewis for this, but if I was an employer and I looked at a resume and didn't see anything relevant, and sorry, the XFL and UFL is not relevant for the last 15 years, I would have questions. So it is relevant. If you're listening out there and you're hearing about Tim Lewis, I hope he succeeds. That's where I want to start that off right now. But I had every right to question who he was because he hadn't coached in pro football in quite a long time.
Yeah, I thought there were the reactions to this were I guess the reaction to the reactions were weird. Like for a guy that hasn't coached in college in the time that I've been, which I think we can quibble about whether the minor leagues are relevant experience. I think there's an argument to be had. The fact that he hasn't coached in college in the time that I've been alive is a little concerning, and obviously, college football has changed. The landscape has changed, wildly in that time. And, it's so different. So maybe it doesn't matter. It's like, oh, it's not as relevant anyways, but still, like, let's be honest. You're being a college defensive coordinator and you haven't coached in college, since the early 90s, which is crazy. And again, when you have been a defensive coordinator in the NFL and the NFL results were, I would say, middling. And in the minor leagues, I would say they've been mostly positive, but not, I wouldn't say overwhelmingly so. So I think it's fair to question this hire. And I think a big part of it also is, we obviously, our job is to, when we didn't know who it was going to be, we floated some names out there. We're like, okay, these are guys who have connections to Bill O'Brien, because when you're doing a coaching search, typically you look for guys who have connections to the guy who's in charge. That's not just a BC thing. It's not just a Jeff Hafley thing. It's a thing that happens across all levels of football. People hire their friends. People hire their friends' kids, as as nepotism rages on in football coaching. But I digress. Regardless, so I think it's fair for us to be skeptical of this hire because we didn't know who this guy was, because again, he hasn't been coaching major football, whether it be professional or major college, in quite a while. And again, he doesn't have any connections to O'Brien. So with that in mind, I spent the last few days looking over Tim Lewis's defenses when he's been coaching the minor leagues. Luckily, most of those games are on YouTube. Unfortunately for the USFL, which is where he was the defensive coordinator for the Houston Gamblers in 2022, most of those games are not on YouTube. It's just highlight compilations. And unfortunately, that's where he was the defensive coordinator, which would be most relevant. At the other stops in 2019, he was the head coach of the Birmingham Iron. And this past year, where he was the co-defensive coordinator, and I believe not the play caller for the Arlington Renegades. But when watching those three teams and there's three defenses, there are certain through lines you can see, okay, that this is Tim Lewis's style. And the big thing that I'm seeing, and upon further watching, it's become less big, but the main takeaway is that I think that Tim Lewis is going to switch BC to a 3-4 defense, which is 3 defensive linemen, 4 linebackers, which in modern football, it doesn't matter as much because almost everybody is running nickel on more than 50% of their snaps. Let me find this stat I have. So, you're most of the time you're having 2 linebackers on the field anyways. So it doesn't matter. Gosh dang it. Where is this? Okay. So in 2023, FBS teams use nickel personnel on 74.1% of their snaps. So that's every team for all their snaps, and only 11 teams used base personnel on more than 50% of their snaps. So it doesn't matter as much, but it still is a pretty significant schematic change because as far as I can tell, BC has been running the 4-3 since the 90s, because it goes going as far back as Frank Spaziani. So it's a pretty big change. When he does use his nickel defense, it does look a little bit more like what BC has been doing. But the other big takeaway is that I would say that Lewis is not as siloed and committed to certain aspects of defense as Jeff Hafley was. Whereas Jeff Hafley was, we're running cover one, we're running cover three, we're running a lot of man coverage, and that's what we're doing. Lewis is a lot more flexible and diverse with his defense. I would say he still leans more toward cover three, some cover one, but it's not going to be a complete shock when he deploys cover two or cover four or something else. He's also pretty aggressive when it comes to blitzing, which is he shares with Hafley. But I would say that the blitzes he uses and the simulated pressures, which are when you only rush four, but you use an unorthodox rusher, whether it be an off-ball linebacker or a defensive back, the blitzes and simulated pressures are much more complex and exotic. And I think part of that comes from when he was coming up as a positional coach in the NFL. He started with the Pittsburgh Steelers under Dick LeBeau, who's the grandfather of the zone blitz defense. And also there's a hire they recently made of a guy named Michael George, who was an assistant for Lewis with the Arlington Renegades last year. And there's a clinic of his, a coaching clinic on YouTube, where he is explaining kind of their philosophy on simulated pressures and blitzing. So I think that Michael George is going to be kind of the guy who's in charge of scheming up that part of the defense. So again, these are pretty drastic schematic shifts. And again, Lewis, there are some tendencies Lewis shares with Hafley, but the point is that whereas, when Hafley was in charge, again, we talked about nickel and base. The other thing that I talk about is Hafley's use of cover one and cover three, which are known as middle of the field closed coverages, because there's a deep safety in the middle of the field. And during that time, during Hafley's tenure, BC ran the most middle field closed coverages in the FBS on 75% of their snaps, and the least middle of the field open coverages at 21%. And also during that time, BC used man coverage at the third highest rate among FBS teams, 43.1%, whereas during that same time, all FBS teams used man coverage on about 27% of their plays. So while I do think that cover one and cover three, middle field closed, are going to be most of what Tim Lewis runs, it's not going to be like BC is leading the way in those categories. They're going to be much more diverse with their coverage shells. And I think that and also the diversity in the front with switching to the 3-4 is going to help players at nearly every level of BC's defense.
And we're going to talk about each of those levels and how it could help in just a moment. Now, college football is over, and I know a lot of us are bummed about that. But the NBA is in full swing, and at FanDuel, you can get buckets with your first bet over on FanDuel. Because right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Jaylen Brown has been playing excellent for the Celtics, and they will have the point spread. His over-under on his points, you can go over there. I think he's going to start hitting them again. You can go over there and make your bet right now. All you got to do is just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. With FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. This is Locked On BCAJ Black. And Mitch is going to talk a little bit about more Tim Lewis for a moment. But if you're interested in how the new staff has been recruiting, I'll have some more details on that next week. But interestingly, the staff has been on the road, and a lot of the new offers have been on the defensive side of the ball, especially linebacker. We've seen a lot more traditional linebackers being offered by the staff, especially Dan O'Brien, the new linebackers coach. And we have coverage about all of that up on Eagle Insider, where you can read my work, Mitch's work. It's all up there. So, Mitch, how is this scheme going to help some of the players and help this defense that was struggling mightily at points last year?
So we'll go back to front, because I think that's kind of the ascending order of importance, if you will, for how this change is going to affect them. On the back end, again, I don't expect a ton to change. Maybe I think BC will run more zone, which I think is, if players can handle it mentally, it's good. If they are, maybe not the best athletes, because they're not being forced to just follow receivers everywhere in man. And especially because BC is going to be more creative with their blitzing out of zone, with zone coverage behind it. So those defenders don't have to just stick with their receivers in man all across the field. and try their best to not give up any separation, which was kind of the issue with Hafley's defense, where it's like, because they're being put in these very difficult coverage assignments, they're struggling to execute them consistently, and quarterbacks can take advantage of it, because when teams played BC, they knew they were getting a ton of middle field close. They knew they were getting a ton of cover one, some cover three. So quarterbacks didn't really have to think as much about what coverage they were seeing. I think now with this defense, they'll need to think a little more, which, that extra time to think and process the defense gives the pass rush some extra time to get to the quarterback and get some sacks, which again, something that we've talked about BC having a real issue with last year. So for the secondary, we'll move to the linebackers. And this, I think, is probably the most important position. And when I say linebackers, I mean off-ball linebackers, because, well, I'll get to it later. I'm under the assumption that Cam Arnold is going to be one starter, and that I would love for Bryce Steele to be the next starter. He's had, with his health issues, we don't know what his status is exactly. It seems positive, but we don't know. And if not, it's not him. Probably some combination of Davion Crouch or Jalen Blackwell as being the two off-ball linebackers. And what the 3-4 does for these players is that it is not asking them, or it is giving them easier ways to fit the run, because the defensive line in front of them, there's more of them, and they are taking on more blockers, because in a 3-4 traditionally, the defensive line is asked to what is called two gapping. And that means that the defensive line takes on one blocker, but they are reading two gaps. And so they are covering both of those, and the linebacker doesn't. Whereas in a 4-3, the linebackers are usually more gap assignment. Whereas in a 3-4, because the blockers are being occupied and the gaps being covered by the defensive line, the linebackers are typically more free to read where the play is going and then get downhill and make a play. And additionally, just with watching Lewis's defenses, the linebackers are being asked to be a lot more aggressive, to just get downhill and get in the backfield and make a play. And I think that could help players like Cam Arnold and Bryce Steele and Davion Crouch, who I think this could be really good for Davion Crouch moving forward as he gets to play more. But I think that it's going to ask them to do a lot less mental processing and just ask them to go play football, which I think that's important for a guy like Cam Arnold, who's had some struggles, some inconsistencies in that area. And I also think that because of how much this defense asks the linebackers to blitz from off-ball alignments and occasionally mugged up in the gaps, it allows Cam Arnold to use his athleticism as a pass rusher, which I think could be a very effective strategy for him. Moving on to the defensive line, first of all, so now you're going to, quote, convert guys like Donovan Ezraku and Nito Ekpala to outside linebackers, but they're basically saying that playing the same position. They are edge rushers. They're playing on the outside shoulders of the offensive tackles, and they'll be playing more consistently in a 2-point stance, standing up, as opposed to 3-point stance with a hand in the dirt, which they already did a decent bit of over the last few years, because BC kind of hybridized those fronts. But I think that this will allow those guys to drop some weight, because they're not going to be taking on offensive tackles as much. They'll be taking on tight ends and getting the outside shoulder, very far outside shoulder of offensive tackles. So, maybe you get them down closer to what their high school weight was, and they can play a little faster, which I think we have hypothesized that might have been an issue regarding their struggles with converting pressures into sacks and then missing sacks in the backfield. So allow those guys to play faster too. And the good news is that Ezraku and Ekpala are already pretty solid run defenders when it comes to taking on blocks, deconstructing them, and making plays in the backfield. So even if they lose a little weight, then that still shouldn't go away. This also allows BC to use their defensive line more, which I would say they are deeper on the defensive line than they are at the linebacker position, because you have a guy like Cam Horsley coming back, who I think he should fit well in the defense. Quan Williams, who should play more as the nose tackle. George Rooks I think he's an interesting fit in this defense. He's going to play more of a defensive end role, where he's going to line up head up across from the offensive tackle. And then you still have big defensive tackles like Nigel Tate, Caleb Jones, and then some of these tweener guys like Ced McConnell, who transferred in from Illinois, and Tyus Clemens, who ideally will be back healthy from injury after missing last year. So I think that this change could really work for BC, because overall they are going to be doing more to make the offense think, take their time, and make mistakes, and give the defense a better chance at reacting and making plays. Because again, one thing I've noticed about Lewis's defense, he is very aggressive, and he teaches the players to be very aggressive for hunting turnovers, hunting big plays in the backfield. And again, sometimes that's going to burn you, but when I was watching all these games for in the minor leagues, his defenses are very consistent at creating turnovers, especially in big moments and especially in the red zone. I think that's something that's going to be really big for BC on defense.
So interesting. So there's some positives to look forward to, and I think honestly, given what we saw last year, any change that we can see with this defense, I think a lot of folks are just willing to take that risk.
Which is funny because that's exactly what I was saying that the Green Bay Packers fans will be doing with Jeff Hafley taking over their defense, because what he does is so different from what they were doing before. So they're also just to be happy because whatever they're doing is different. Which obviously, it's just funny that they're getting the mirrored thing, even though they're getting the guy that everybody at BC wanted out.
It's an interesting thing, and I can't wait to see what happens. So we're gonna wrap things up. This is the end of our episode. Mitch, where can people find you?
You can find me at Mitchell T. Wolfe, WOLFE on Twitter. I'm gonna be having an article on this topic coming out soon. Just kind of watching the rest of the games that are available, and then I'll be able to put some screenshots, some clips to kind of explain this in a more visual format as opposed to audio, which admittedly can be a little confusing. So it'll be easier to understand there and have some more stats and stuff like that. So just keep your eyes on Eagle Insider for that, because that's where that'll be coming out, and then also we'll obviously have draft coverage, reaction to whatever Elijah Jones and Christian Mahogany do at the combine, and then it's kind of on to pro days from there.
All right, this is AJ Black. We have recruiting news. I've said it all week. We've got BC Hockey Blogger covering the hockey team who's playing exceptionally well. We've got Mitch doing all his football work. We have Beacon Street Ball discussing the collapse of BC basketball. Come on over, check it all out. And follow me on Twitter at AJBlack247. And make sure you hit that like or subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're on YouTube, that helps as well. Thank you all so much for listening to our show today. And for all you everydayers, you guys are the lifeblood of this podcast. Thank you all so much. And for all you newbies, we appreciate you as well. For Mitch, this is AJ. Thank you for listening to Locked On Boston College, your team every day.